to our next speaker, Roly Owers. Roly is a qualified veterinary surgeon and has been chief executive of the charity World Horse Welfare since 2008. He graduated from Cambridge University in 1992 and acquired his master's degree in nutrition from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in 1997. His previous veterinary roles included the Blue Cross and Royal Army Veterinary Corps, and Roly is a longtime advisor to sports regulators on the responsible use of horses in sport. He is currently treasurer of the British Equine Veterinary Association, chairman of the UK Equine Disease Coalition, a director of the British Horse Council, and a board member of the European Horse Network. Today, Roly will explain in depth the continually evolving welfare consciousness, what constitutes good welfare, and how to apply those principles throughout the life cycle of the horse. Roly?
Andrew, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you here today. It's wonderful to be in South Africa, home of the current Rugby World Champions. As an English supporter, that's slightly difficult to say, but you played an outstanding game. Well done. We're here to talk about the evolving responsibility for our horses. And why it is evolving? Quite simply, A, because our understanding of equine welfare is evolving, and secondly, because we are very much living in a changing world. And in that regard, I attended the integrity session this morning, which I thought was excellent. And obviously, integrity and equine welfare, as was mentioned this morning, are very much interlinked. And I was very taken by these two quotes. The first from C.S. Lewis: integrity is about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. And the second one from an Australian Army officer, David Morrison: the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And I think when we think about equine welfare, there's so much that those two quotes could help us improve the way we do things today. So I'm going to very quickly talk about World Horse Welfare and our association with horse sport. I mentioned about the changing nature of public perception, to introduce what we believe constitutes good welfare and how that is changing, and then introduce this idea of social license. It was mentioned several times this morning, how that can be practically applied across all stages of a horse's life, and then hopefully within 19 minutes just come together with some concluding comments about what does that all mean. So, World Horse Welfare, we will be celebrating our 100th anniversary in 2027, and since our foundation, we've always adopted a pragmatic approach to horse welfare. We do have very strong veterinary credentials, certainly not me, but on our veterinary advisory committee, we have the likes of Professor Tim Pargin at Glasgow University and John McEwen, past Vice President of the FEI. And over the last 30 years, we have evolved a relationship with the FEI and with British Racing. And for the last 10 years, we've been a member of the British Equestrian Federation. Now, we're proud in the UK to have a partnership with retraining of racehorses. That has been going for several years now and has been extremely effective. And obviously, our capacity within the UK can help support the few thoroughbreds that fall into vulnerable positions. But of course, it's not just the ones that we see through ROR. Our field network do periodically come into contact with thoroughbreds that have reached precarious situations. But on an advisory role, just for British Racing, we had an active part in last year's Cheltenham Festival Review, and were involved in the Horse Welfare Board's strategy, which went public about half an hour ago, I think, in the UK. So what do I mean when we live in a changing world? I mean, it sounds extremely corny, but partly because of social media, partly because of the growing urbanization of society across the globe, we do have a society that is viewing animal welfare very differently. And so we would talk about a partnership, some would talk about exploitation. We would talk about use, but not abuse being the focus. Some would say use is abuse. And we simply can't ignore those growing voices, and they are growing voices, across the world. Because what we do need to understand is whatever part we play in the horse world, whether we're a leisure horse rider, whether we're in the racing world, whether we're in the horse sport world of dressage or any other, as far as the vast majority of the general public across the world are concerned, it's people on horses. And it's no more complicated than that. And so what happens in racing, what happens in show jumping, affects all horse sport, not just racing or show jumping. And of course, we need to understand that this ethical tightrope that we're on is not going to go away. And I think when we have headlines like the recent outcome following the ABC programme on Australia, the racing industry in Australia has fundamentally failed to intervene at industry level to effectively protect retired racehorses. They are fairly damning words, but we certainly don't want to believe that it's just in Australia, because whether it's in the UK, in the US, in Ireland, or any other racing jurisdiction across the world, bad news stories have come out. And it has a real impact on all horse sport. So, what do we mean by good welfare? I think it's really important to stress that our understanding of equine welfare is changing. And it's changing in a very fundamental way. It certainly does not mean that one size fits all. Horses, in their own way, are individuals, and we need to be better at managing individual horses for their individual ways. And what probably is the biggest change over the last 10 years or so is recognizing that actually looking after the physical welfare of horses is certainly not more important and might be less important than looking after their mental welfare. So when we talk about the evolution of the 5 freedoms, which is widely recognized across the world and certainly has improved the welfare of farmed animals across the world, we now move on to talk about the 5 domains. Because the key differences are, it's not just about avoiding negative incidents. It's as much about promoting positive incidents. And we need to be better able to understand our horses, and therefore good horsemanship is fundamental to good welfare. And of course, when we talk the changing nature of equine welfare, because it's changing, it does mean we have to constantly challenge ourselves with how we are managing our horses, and we have to be open-minded to making changes in how we manage them. And one specific aspect of the 5 domains, increasingly people are talking around the 3 Fs: freedom, food, and forage. And this is because horses naturally are grazing animals. They would graze for 17 hours a day. Naturally, they are herd animals, and therefore they are very social. And the ability to, and the desire to allogroom, to groom each other, is a very important part. And of course, their ability to graze, eat, forage for 17 hours a day is equally true. So we need to think about that when we talk about equine welfare and how we can improve it. So then that brings us on to the idea of the social license. What is a social license? Well, it's, as it says on the screen here, it's not a written agreement, it's an unwritten agreement between the society, the public at large, and the sport. This actually originated out of the mining industry in the late 90s, when obviously in mining industry there is a great sort of threat to human health and welfare by sending people underground into mines, but there's also a considerable environmental impact. And therefore those companies have to work very hard to maintain and enhance their social license, because if they didn't have one, they simply wouldn't be able to do business. And that's exactly the same for horse sport. If we don't have a social license, we simply won't be able to do business. And the one example that is pretty crystal clear, although it hasn't been banned outright in Australia, greyhound racing in Australia is widely perceived to have lost its social license, in part because it ignored about the growing clamour of what happened to greyhounds when they left the greyhound track. And the consequences of that have been significant. And just to pick up on Di's point, it is a collective responsibility. When we talk about evolving and maintaining our social license, Each and every one of us, whatever involvement we have in horse sport across the piece, we have a responsibility to enhance and maintain that social license. So you wouldn't be surprised to know that there's obviously a traffic-like system to the social license concept like there is to everything in life. And I would be interested to know, maybe we could discuss it later, where horse racing is on that. Because I think we can fairly safely say it is not being rejected, but I think we could equally say it hasn't been completely accepted. And therefore, it's somewhere in the middle. Where is it in the middle, and how can we drive it down so it can be more widely accepted? So having sort of set that sort of scene, how do we incorporate this into practice? I think what underlines everything, and as talked about already, is how we care for our horses. Horses suffer across the world because of their interaction with humans. And we've got to focus on why that is, and it's as true to say if you're a horse owner in Guatemala who uses their horse to support their very livelihoods, as it is if you're in the leisure or sport industries. I think the key here, as I've already mentioned, is the willingness to challenge the way we manage our horses. And turnout is a very good example. It's not to say stabling is the enemy here, far from it, but it is to say that we need to think more about how we can give our horses on a daily basis at least some turnout. Traceability, and I know Simon's going to be talking more about this, but the basis of supporting and enhancing equine health and welfare is to have a traceable system, to know where our horses are and how many horses there are. This is obviously extremely important when we're thinking about equine health. If you have an incursion of the disease, the first thing you want to know is where the horses are and how you can manage that disease outbreak so you can get rid of it as quickly as possible. But it also provides us with great data to be able to see how we're managing horses in their lifetime during their racing career and how we can maximize, through the data we've identified and researched, how we can maximize their chances for having a good second career post-racing. Now, of course, when we look at a horse's life, we start at the beginning, and responsible breeding underlies, for sure, maintaining the social license, because we need to consider what is going to happen to each and every foal that is born. I think a growing challenge for us over the coming years is going to be equine genomics. And our ability now to clone animals. Clearly, AI is not something allowed in the thoroughbred world, but I think the changing nature of our understanding of breeding is going to bring considerable ethical challenges to the sport. Of course, what happens in their racing career is really important. And I think when we talk about challenging the status quo, and I would say this for any part of the equine industry, there are certainly things that we need to be looking at. And in racing, this could include existing management of gastric ulcers in racehorses, and it certainly should include regular interventions like wind operations and medication of joints. And then, of course, what IFAR is very much focused about, what we can do with horses that leave racing. For sure, many of those horses can go on to an active second career, but it's really important to recognize that not all. And I think we have to be very clear with that through the social license, get people to understand that that is not always going to be the case. It is, of course, especially important for new owners to understand what they're taking on. Having ridden, I've never ridden under rules, but I've ridden a number of ex-race horses. Thoroughbreds are horses, and I think sometimes we can believe that thoroughbreds are a complete different species. It's not the case, but certainly in the way they've been bred and in the way they've been trained, they do have some special gifts, and they do need careful care with regards to that. And of course, we've got to remember that it doesn't matter if a horse never actually reached a racetrack. As far as the general public is concerned, a racehorse will always be a racehorse, whether it's 1 month old or 21 years old. So when we take that first step, and I know a number of racing jurisdictions around the world are trying to do this now, it is important because that first step, that first sale or that first loan from their active racing career is where you have direct influence. Of course, once it's sold, you have no direct influence. So it's really important to get that first step right. So knowing where every single thoroughbred that leaves racing goes as a first step, I would say, is a fundamental requirement to having the understanding of where those horses are. Because what we do know is, as I've already said, that data, that analysis is really important for the benefit of the horses and the sector. But not having that data to hand allows those who wish to undermine the sport always to score an own goal or on the industry, because they will make a lot out of the fact that we don't know, you don't know where your horses are. And one thing, when I was asked to speak at the IFAR meeting in Newmarket a few years ago, is around euthanasia. And the one thing that I try to stress then is in all these deliberations, quality of life has always got to trump quantity of life. Now, Royal Horse Welfare in the UK, we have nearly 2,000 horses in homes, so we have a fairly robust system now, developed over many, many decades, of how to rehome horses. And it is hard work because it involves finding the right people, it involves finding the right homes, and then making sure that we keep a monitor of those animals for their lifetime. And with all of this, it's always a challenge. It doesn't often happen, but you do have to, when you are rehoming horses, to be prepared to take them back. Now, this is obviously one of the most challenging subjects facing animal ownership across the board. And a saying we often say is, it's the primary responsibility of every animal owner to give their animal a good life and a good death. Across the world, of course, this is challenging. There's sometimes real challenges around the legality of the euthanasia. There's sometimes challenges around availability of medication and also availability of trained personnel. I would always stress that although a lot of the headlines over the last 24 months have been around abattoirs and horrific care of animals going to abattoirs, that should not mean the same as actually sending into a horse to an abattoir is by definition the wrong thing to do. If it is done to regulation, which is at least OIE standard or above, then we believe it can be a humane end to an animal's life. But of course, there are significant cultural and religious challenges across the world, and we absolutely recognize that. But at the end of the day, I do not believe there is any culture or any religion which would actively promote animal welfare neglect, and that is the key point to make. So it is really important when we rehome or we sell on that we don't make the unacceptable career choices. We see time and time again, and Di mentioned it, you pass a horse on with a problem from owner to owner to owner, it goes in a spiral of neglect and decay, and it ends up in a very, very bad place. So horses rehomed without the proper checks are at much greater risk ending up just like that. So in terms of a summary of what I've talked about, I think we need to understand that racing, like all horse sport, needs public support. And we need to actively undertake to maintain that social license, which is about doing right by our horses and our evolving understanding of equine welfare, but also showing the world that we are doing that too. As I mentioned, our understanding of equine welfare is changing. And I think we have to have a very open mind and be very willing to change the way we do things. Some things we've been doing for decades. Just because we've been doing it for decades doesn't make it necessarily right. And of course, responsible use of horses in sport involves a lifetime commitment. Euthanasia can and should be considered for some horses the responsible choice to be made in the interests of their welfare. And for sure, passing on a problem horse is going to put that horse and the sector's social license in great, great danger. Thank you very much indeed.
No, thank you very much, Roly. And I think you were right to use the term evolving and evolution. That's the critical term here, because if we as an industry don't react to challenges, or even in some cases predict risks to horse welfare, that public support, that social license is quite at risk. So society is changing and changing very rapidly these days. We need to be ready. So thank you again for that.